The air in Philadelphia during the summer of 1776 was not fit for gods or men. It was humid, thick, and swarming with flies that paid no mind to the gravity of the proceedings. Inside a rented second-floor parlor, a man, impossibly tall, thin, and red-haired, bent over a portable writing desk he had designed himself. He was not a warrior. He was not an orator. In fact, he despised public speaking, his voice often trembling into an inaudible murmur. But he was a weapon nonetheless. His name was Thomas Jefferson, and he was, at 33, about to commit treason with an inkwell. He dipped his quill and wrote the words that would ignite a revolution, not just of muskets, but of the human mind. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. This is the story of that man. It is the story of the mind that conceived the American creed, but it is also the story of the staggering, terrible, and deeply human contradiction at its heart. For the same hand that wrote liberty also signed bills of sale. The philosopher who dreamed of an empire of liberty lived his entire life supported by the forced labor of over 600 enslaved human beings. This is not just the story of a president. It is the story of an architect, a scientist, a farmer, a diplomat, and a hypocrite. It is the story of America itself, born in soaring idealism and tragic compromise. The story begins. Chapter 1. The Red Earth of Shadwell. To understand the man who could write liberty with one hand and deny it with the other, one must first understand the soil from which he sprang. Thomas Jefferson was born on April 13, 1743, at Shadwell, a tobacco plantation in what was then the wild western frontier of the Virginia colony. He was not born into the tidewater aristocracy, the ancient families like the Carters or the Lees who ruled the coast. He was born of a paradox. His father, Peter Jefferson, was a force of nature. A self-taught surveyor, cartographer, and planter, Peter was a man of immense physical strength who had literally carved his home from the wilderness. He represented the rugged, self-reliant individualism of the frontier. From him, Thomas inherited a deep love of the land, a meticulous scientific mind, and a skepticism of centralized power. Peter Jefferson, alongside his friend Joshua Fry, had created the definitive map of Virginia, pushing its boundaries into the unknown West. He taught his son to ride, to hunt, and to observe the world with empirical rigor. His mother, Jane Randolph, was the opposite. She was a member of one of Virginia's most powerful and aristocratic families. From the Randolphs, Thomas inherited social standing, a refined taste, and a complex web of familial obligations that defined the Virginia gentry. He was, from birth, caught between two worlds, the Enlightenment meritocracy of his father and the inherited slave-based aristocracy of his mother. This tension defined him. He was a frontier intellectual, a patrician farmer. He loved books more than people, finding solace in the quiet rationality of Isaac Newton, Francis Bacon, and John Locke, his trinity of immortals. His education was his forge. He studied relentlessly, first under local tutors, then at the College of William and Mary in the colonial capital of Williamsburg.
There, he fell under the mentorship of three men who shaped his mind. Professor William Small, who introduced him to the wonders of science and the Enlightenment. George Wythe, the colony's preeminent classical scholar and lawyer, who trained him in the law. And Governor Francis Fauquier, the sophisticated and worldly royal governor, who invited the brilliant young student to dinner parties where philosophy, politics, and science were discussed over fine wine. Jefferson absorbed it all. He practiced the violin for 3 hours a day, studied law for 5, and read philosophy, history, and agriculture for the rest. He was building an intellect designed to order the world. But the world he inhabited was built on disorder. When his father died in 1757, Thomas, at age 14, inherited thousands of acres of land, and with that land, he inherited human beings. This was the ordinance of his world. The Virginia economy was not built on ideals, it was built on tobacco, and tobacco was built on slavery. To be a gentleman, to have the leisure to read philosophy, to practice architecture, to contemplate the rights of man, one had to own other men. Jefferson hated the system. He called it a moral depravity and an abominable crime. He knew with terrifying clarity that it was wrong and that it would one day destroy the nation. "I tremble for my country," he would later write, "when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever."
And yet, he participated. He bought, sold, and bred enslaved people. He calculated their productivity. He designed his mountaintop home, Monticello, his academical village, dedicated to reason and light, and had it built by enslaved hands. This was the central, agonizing conflict of his life. He was a man trapped in a system he intellectually despised, but from which he materially benefited every single day. His first foray into politics showed this conflict in stark relief. Elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses in 1769, one of his very first legislative proposals was a bill to allow owners to emancipate or free their slaves. The bill was soundly, almost violently rejected. The elder statesmen of the House shouted him down. The young, awkward Jefferson fell silent, learning a harsh lesson. To challenge the peculiar institution was to challenge the very foundation of Virginia's power. He turned his focus elsewhere. As tensions with Great Britain escalated, Jefferson found a voice not in speaking, but in writing. In 1774, he authored A Summary View of the Rights of British America. It was a radical document, intended as instructions for Virginia's delegates to the First Continental Congress. It went further than anyone else dared. It didn't just argue against taxation without representation. It argued that the British Parliament had no authority whatsoever over the colonies. It argued that the colonists had migrated to America as a natural right, just as the Saxons had migrated to England and owed allegiance only to the king they had adopted. The pamphlet electrified the colonies and marked him as a premier revolutionary thinker. When the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia, the delegates knew who he was. They knew the tall, quiet Virginian was the man with the sharpest pen. And so, in June 1776, when the committee was formed to draft a Declaration of Independence, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and the others turned to him. Adams, pragmatic and blunt, insisted. Reason number one, you are a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to appear at the head of this business. Reason number two, I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. You are very much otherwise. Reason number three, you can write 10 times better than I can. Jefferson protested. He was a committee man. He wanted to help draft Virginia's new state constitution, but he accepted. He returned to his rented rooms, shut out the flies and the noise, and began to draft the world. He didn't invent the ideas. He was, as he later said, simply expressing the common sense of the subject. He drew from the English philosopher John Locke, who argued for life, liberty, and property, and from the Virginia Declaration of Rights, penned by his friend George Mason. But Jefferson did something transcendent. He took dry political theory and set it to music. He changed property, that ancient right of kings and landowners, to the pursuit of happiness. It was a revolutionary substitution. It declared that the purpose of government was not merely to protect what one owned, but to enable what one could become. It was a radical Enlightenment ideal, a promise of human potential. The draft he presented to Congress, however, contained one other explosive and now forgotten passage. It was his longest and most passionate charge against King George. He accused the king of waging cruel war against human nature itself, of violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere. He blamed the king for the slave trade. It was a brilliant, if dishonest, rhetorical move, an attempt by a slaveholder to blame slavery on the monarch. The other delegates would not have it. The representatives from South Carolina and Georgia, whose economies were utterly dependent on the slave trade, rose in protest. Even some northern delegates, whose shipping fortunes were built on the triangular trade, grew uneasy. In the sweltering heat of the debate, the committee cut the passage. They struck out his condemnation of slavery, his one attempt to write his private agony into the public creed. Jefferson was furious. He sat silently, brooding as they mangled his masterpiece. On July 4, 1776, the document was adopted. The words, "All men are created equal," remained, but the clause that might have begun to reckon with its hypocrisy was gone. The bells rang, but for Thomas Jefferson, the compromise was a bitter one. He had written the poetry of human freedom, but he and the new nation were still chained to the reality of human bondage. This single act, the soaring words and the silent deleted clause, was the blueprint for the next 50 years of his life and the next 2 centuries of the American experiment. He would go on to be a wartime governor of Virginia, an ambassador who fell in love with Paris and, scandalously, with one of his own slaves, the architect of the separation of church and state, and the first Secretary of State fighting brutal political battles against Alexander Hamilton over the very soul of the nation. And he would be the man who, in perhaps his most astonishing and least known act, drafted the law that almost strangled slavery in its cradle. This was his ordinance. In 1784, just after the war, Jefferson was tasked with drafting a plan for the vast, untamed Western territories that would become Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. In his draft, Jefferson, the man from the slave-holding South, wrote a simple clause, that after the year 1800 there shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in any of the said states. He wasn't just limiting its expansion, he was setting an expiration date. The bill came before the Confederate Congress. It was put to a vote. It needed 7 states to pass. 6 voted in favor. 1 state, New Jersey, had a delegate who was sick and could not vote. Because of that one sick delegate, the clause failed by a single vote. Jefferson was devastated. He wrote, "Thus we see the fate of millions unborn, hanging on the tongue of one man, and heaven was silent in that awful moment." He had almost achieved through law what he failed to achieve through rhetoric in 1776. The failure of the 1784 Ordinance ensured that slavery would not die a quiet death, but would instead expand, fester, and one day require a baptism of blood and iron to cleanse. This was the man, a colossus of intellect and a portrait of contradiction. His story was only just beginning.